In April, it seems people have the itch to try something new. Just like every year, as the end of April approaches, there's been an increase in climbers with brand new gear. At the lodge, while serving meals, I'm constantly on the lookout for anyone who might be overconfident in their shiny new equipment. Preventing accidents before they happen is also part of the job for those of us making a living off the mountain. My name's Jake Sullivan. I just turned 29 this year. If you ask me about my profession, I'd stumble a bit on the answer. Currently, I'm working as a mountain guide and part-time at the lodge. I stay in the US working these part-time jobs, and once I've saved up enough, I set out to conquer mountains overseas. Mountaineering is expensive, and things like permits can be a hassle, so I can't always jump right into it. It's especially tough for a broke climber like me. But a job with a goal in mind doesn't feel like a burden. This season, being able to live and entrust myself to the wilderness is my ideal environment. Today is the last Saturday of April, and many people are heading into a long weekend. The lodge is bustling. There are plenty of regulars. But there was one woman who clearly stood out. She seemed to have depleted quite a bit of energy to get here. Her pale complexion didn't strike me as that of a frequent mountain goer. She was panting and carefully settled herself down at a corner in front of the lodge, so as not to get in the way of others. She was constantly checking the heel of her left foot. She probably has a blister from her new hiking boots. I went inside the lodge for a moment, picked up a Band-Aid specially designed for blisters, and approached the woman. The sun hid behind my back, casting a shadow around her as she sat down. When I saw her lift her head in surprise, I was momentarily captivated. I mean, she was more beautiful than any other woman I had ever met. I'm not sure how to explain it, but she had a sort of translucent, fragile beauty. Her long jet black hair was tied up with a hair tie, but it shone brilliantly. "Excuse me, aren't you getting a blister? Here, take this." As I offered her a plaster, she looked at me suspiciously. She seemed to be on guard, being approached by a big guy on top of a mountain. I explained that I was a mountain guide, and also worked part-time at a mountain hut. With this, her tension eased a bit. "Thank you." In a small voice, she accepted the plaster. All the while, I couldn't help but look at her gear. It all seemed brand new, like this was her first time hiking. "How far are you planning to go?" I casually asked her as she took off her hiking boots and lowered her socks to check her heel. It was already past noon. If she aimed for the summit from here, she would end up walking back in the dark, which could be dangerous. Ideally, I wanted her to turn back here or aim for the summit tomorrow morning. Despite my hopes, she told me that she intended to reach the summit. Fog was starting to hang around the summit. Mountain weather can change quickly. Even if you aim for the summit now, it will be dark by the time you descend. There's fog coming in as well. Wouldn't it be better to give up for today and aim for the summit tomorrow morning after spending the night at the hut? On hearing my words, she frowned in discomfort. She seemed to dislike being instructed by others. But this was a matter of life, and I wasn't ready to back down just yet. If she got lost and the colleagues who went to rescue her got into trouble, I couldn't bear the thought. "I appreciate your concern, but I have my own plans. I find it uncomfortable to be directed by a stranger like you." Contrary to her delicate and seemingly quiet appearance, she clearly voiced her opinion. I was a little surprised by this unexpected gap. Casting a glance at me, she quickly started to pack her things. She seemed to want to leave here as soon as possible. "Hold on a minute, are you really going?" She ignored my hurried words. It looked like it was going to be difficult to stop her. I quickly called out to the boss of the mountain hut, explaining that a potentially dangerous guest was going up and I was going to accompany her. He quickly gave the go-ahead, so I grabbed my always-ready backpack and followed her. Soon, I could see her brand-new backpack. Thinking she might dislike it if I got too close, I kept my distance while watching her clumsy hike. Just as I expected, her pace was slow. All the other hikers we passed were hurrying down the mountain. The fog near the peak thickened, and the scent of rain grew stronger. Unaware of the changing weather, she was persistently moving her feet. Even a dull guy like me could tell that she had some reason for climbing this mountain. I wish I could grant her desire. But this weather isn't good. I caught up with her at a run and called out, "We'll have rain soon, let's turn back." Caught on the shoulder by me, she turns back in surprise. Her face had turned completely pale. She must have been pushing herself too hard to get this far. It might even be difficult to turn back all at once from here. "You're persistent. Leave me alone." She tried to shake off my hand on her shoulder, but it seems like she didn't have the strength left for even that. The next moment, a streak of lightning flashes, followed by a thunderclap. Big droplets of rain started to fall immediately. "Do you have a raincoat?" She shakes her head in response to my question. I was a little annoyed at whatever sports store she had gotten her gear from. Not at her. I was annoyed at the salesperson who hadn't given her any rain gear. But this was no time to be annoyed. The rain was getting worse by the second. I hurriedly set up a small tent in a place off the path that looked safe. "For now, get in." Just after I forced the somewhat resistant her into the tent, the rain turned into a downpour. I'm glad we made it in just in time. I was deeply relieved that we got in before we were soaked to the bone. The small tent was barely enough for 2 people. To prevent it from being blown away, I go outside once and secure it properly. When I come back into the tent, she silently offers me a towel. "Thanks." I gratefully wipe my wet body with the towel. It smelled faintly of fabric softener. It was pouring. The raindrops seemed like they might pierce through the tent. I used a solid fuel to boil water and made cocoa. It was a storm outside, but the sweet aroma of the cocoa made me forget about it. The inside of the small tent felt like a different world. "Here you go." As I offered her the prepared cocoa, she slightly nodded and accepted it. The cocoa warmed her from inside. Perhaps it was just my imagination, but her complexion seemed a bit better. "Tomorrow morning, let's aim for the summit." There was no response from her to my words. The next morning, the rain ceased as if it had never been. We decided to head for the summit at dawn with the sunrise. She insisted that she could go alone, but I persuaded her and watched from a close but not too close distance. Maybe she was getting used to the mountain a bit. Her footsteps seemed lighter than yesterday. As her determination to reach the summit is such high, she'll surely smile once she reaches the top. I followed her, thinking such thoughts. Now here comes the unbelievable part. When we finally reached the summit, there was no smile on her face. She was just staring intently at the other mountains visible from the peak. I couldn't possibly think she had come mountain climbing because she liked mountains. She didn't even take pictures or express joy. She left the summit within less than 5 minutes. And just like that, she started descending as if fleeing. She didn't look back at me, and of course, didn't utter a single word of gratitude. I didn't help her because I wanted gratitude, but it still saddened me. In the end, I never even got to know her name. I've met an unbelievably rude woman. As soon as I got back to the cabin, I told my part-time colleagues about last night. I rarely get angry, but my colleagues found it funny and laughed at me holding their stomachs. I truly thought she was a rude woman. That was my first encounter with her. Mountains are inherently dangerous, and even the skilled people can abruptly lose their lives. A senior who guides mountain climbing with me, called Bob, once lost a climbing partner on a mountain abroad. Both of them had a long history of climbing and were skilled. "It's sudden," Bob chuckled bitterly. Today was the 3rd anniversary of his climbing partner's death. He asked me to accompany him to pay respects, so I went with him to buy incense and flowers for the deceased's grave. The destination was a well-kept cemetery. In one corner of the cemetery, I saw a figure praying ardently in front of the tombstone. As we approached, the figure quickly stood up. "What? It's the rude woman I met on the mountain the other day." In my astonishment, the truth slipped out of my mouth. Suddenly, Bob reached out and covered my mouth. "Bob, you remembered my husband's 3rd-year anniversary, didn't you?" she quietly said. I could feel a tense energy radiating from Bob, who stood next to me. Bob is usually a bright individual and always positive. He never feels out of place and is kind to everyone. Seeing such a person so tensed up, I was taken aback. "There's no way I could forget, Laura," Bob managed to squeeze out. "It seems like she is Laura, the wife of his late climbing partner." That he would address her by her first name. They must have been close in the past. But now, there's a cold wind blowing between the two. Laura stared at Bob with icy eyes. "Did you climb the mountain? Did you get to like it a bit?" Bob asked after a moment of silence. Probably he couldn't withstand Laura's cold gaze and silence any longer. "No, not at all. I despise it even more. I just can't understand people who climb mountains," Laura said, her lips twisted in disdain. It seemed as if she was choosing her words to hurt Bob. "Laura, do you hate me?" "What? You're asking the obvious. Of course, I hate both the mountain and you." Leaving these harsh words behind, Laura walked away. After she left, Bob just crumbled and sat down on the spot. That night, I went out for drinks with Bob. I was worried about letting him go home alone. He rarely got drunk, but that night, he was terribly inebriated. Again and again, he mumbled words of apology to Laura in a groaning voice. I have never seen Bob like this before. It almost made me hate Laura, who was pushing him to this point. By the time I managed to get him into his apartment, the sky was already beginning to lighten. The next day, Bob was back to his usual self. Looking a little shy, he apologized for his behavior the night before, saying, "Sorry about that." All I could muster was, "It's okay." Once I returned to the mountains, I diligently continued my work. By the time the tourist season was ending, I could see the prospects of securing funds for my next climbing expedition. I was considering trying to climb Denali in Alaska. That's what I had been thinking about all this time. Of course, I didn't have such a conceited idea that I could conquer it in one go. I am merely a challenger. I intend to challenge it as many times as it takes. Upon hearing this, my longtime friend, Steve, offered to support me. He is looking for companies that could provide financial support. The reason I had come down from the mountains to return to the city after such a long time was because I received a message from him saying that he had found a company likely to provide funding. It happened to be a time when preparations that couldn't be done in the mountains, like gathering equipment and submitting applications, had been piling up. I borrowed a suit, something I was not accustomed to wearing, from Steve and got myself reasonably dressed. I told him that I should be fine in my usual outfit, but Steve told me, "It's a big corporation." The place he took me to was the headquarters of a large company that even I, being disconnected from the world, knew about. The massive building was overwhelming. From the entrance, you could see business people in suits going in and out, looking very busy. I couldn't believe that Steve had managed to rope in such a big company. I followed him into the building's entrance. The lobby at the end of the bright, open atrium seemed to reflect a positive and open corporate culture. While Steve was confirming our appointment at the reception counter, I absent-mindedly stared into the lobby. Right in the center of the lobby, they were in the process of refreshing the flowers in a large vase. Is that? There she was, Laura. She was arranging flowers in front of the large vase with certainty. Her profile looked very serious. I looked around to see if there was any other staff, but there was no one. Noticing my gaze, Laura stopped arranging the flowers and looked over. I involuntarily shuddered. Narrowing her eyes slightly, she confirmed it was me, and without hesitation, started walking towards me. I panicked at her approach. I thought she might throw harsh words at me again. I had an important presentation coming up. It would be disastrous if my spirit broke at a time like this. But there was nowhere for me to escape. I closed my eyes tightly and repeated a soothing mantra. I even prayed that she had mistaken me for someone else. I didn't get your name before. I have something I need to apologize to you for." I opened my eyes wide in response to her unexpected words. There in front of me was the face of the woman I'd been smitten with that day. When we met on the mountain, I think her makeup had all but melted away due to sweat, leaving her almost barefaced. Today, Laura had her makeup neatly done and seemed like a professional woman. What do you mean?" Suddenly, I was thrown into confusion by her change in attitude. In my dream, I was scolded by him. Her late husband appeared in her dream, apparently scolding her for her disrespectful behavior towards me. It seemed she was repeatedly urged to forgive my mentor, Bob. I thought about it when I woke up. I was immature. I sort of ran away without even thanking you for saving my life. "Thank you for that time," she said a bit bashfully and deeply bowed to me. I somehow felt embarrassed and acted awkwardly. "If you have time, I would like to treat you to lunch. I owe you an apology for many things." As I nervously responded, Laura proposed this. Of course, I readily agreed. Laura smiled happily and said, "I'm glad," upon hearing my response. She went back to her work after we decided to meet up at the entrance. Steve, watching me entranced by her, rolled his eyes. The presentation to the company was a great success, and it was decided we would receive financial support. It seems they'll also provide us with gear. It's truly a blessing. I deeply appreciated Steve's effort. Laura arrived a bit late to the entrance where we decided to meet. "I'm sorry, I was tied up with some work stuff." I was again taken aback as she runs up, panting. I guess she's just my type. I've never felt like this in my life before. The place Laura had reserved was a restaurant serving Nepalese cuisine. It seems it was her late husband's favorite restaurant. The dal soup with spices, herbs, and beans was also my favorite, so I was genuinely happy that she chose this restaurant. He used to bring me here a lot. He said he would eat this in Nepal as well. He used all kinds of ways to try to take me to the mountains. She smiled a little sadly as she remembers her late husband. Thinking about Laura's feelings makes my heart ache a little. "Did you have some business with that company after coming down from the mountain?" When asked by Laura, I told her that they'd become our corporate sponsor. I informed Laura that I would be challenging Denali next. She frowned a little at that. Denali, it's been a while since I've heard that. It's a mountain that every climber longs for. She must have heard it numerous times from her husband. Perhaps even Laura's husband had expressed his desire to challenge Denali. I'm sorry. Without thinking, the words of apology slipped out. At my words, Laura's eyes widened in surprise. And then, in the next moment, her eyes narrowed in a smile. Don't be silly. There's nothing to apologize for. With a tone like she was talking to a child, I found myself feeling somewhat diminished. I'm not a child who can't understand what he said in his dreams, but hatred and forgiveness are complicated things. Laura said that she understood this in her head. No one was at fault. But she can't stop the feelings of hatred. Forgiving is even more difficult. Living is quite a tough task. Laura sighed softly. For the first time, I felt like I touched the folds of a human heart. It was delicate, complex, and sometimes troublesome, but it felt like evidence of being human. Perhaps you don't have to forgive. That's the general public's opinion, not necessarily how you feel, right? I wasn't sure if I should say such a thing. But I couldn't not say it. There's no need to conform to a certain mold. You can hate when you feel hatred. Forgive when the time comes to forgive. I think that kind of freedom should be allowed. A distressed image of my senior, Bob, crossed my mind, but these words were my true feelings. It's just absurd to suppress feelings in order to fit in the stereotype. Yes, thank you, I feel a lot better. As she said that, Laura's face seemed to lighten, like a weight had been lifted off her. As we said goodbye, Laura reached out her hand for a handshake. I firmly gripped her slender hand in return. She didn't say a word, but I felt like her hand was saying, "Come back alive." I met Laura again a year and a half after that day. My attempt at Denali had ended in failure. Bad weather played a part, but the mistake was mine. It would be fair to say that it was a desperate retreat. In the continuing bad weather, I dug a snow cave and endured. If rescue had come even a day later, I don't think I would have survived. When I woke up in the hospital, flown in by helicopter, all medical procedures had been completed. I had 2 toes and my right little and ring fingers amputated due to frostbite. When I heard about the procedure, I didn't feel despair. I just thought that I could still climb. It might sound stupid, but that's really what I thought. The first thing I did today, after finishing my treatment and finally returning to the States, was to look for a hamburger shop. I just wanted to have American food, and I couldn't help it. I ordered cheeseburger at an old, traditional restaurant. After one bite, I felt like crying. I felt like I had finally come home. Next, I went to see Laura. I knew where her flower shop was before leaving the States. Not wanting to disturb her work, I waited at a nearby cafe until her shop closed. I could see Laura working. I think spending my afternoon absent-mindedly watching Laura going about her daily routine, a life I knew nothing about, was a luxury. In line with the closing time of the flower shop, I left the cafe. And then, I eagerly waited outside the flower shop for Laura to come out. Laura. After making sure she had pulled down the shutter and locked it, I called out to her quietly. Sitting on the guardrail on the sidewalk, I waved to her. Laura was genuinely surprised. "What, Jake, really?" She put her bag down in front of the shutter and ran over to me. I jumped off the guardrail and extended my right hand to her. The right hand she had extended to me when we said goodbye. I thought it was my turn to offer it this time. When Laura ran over to me, she took a sharp breath as she looked at my face. The signs of severe frostbite were still very visible on my face. It was in a pretty bad shape. Even a part of the top of my ear was missing. On top of that, my right hand was still wrapped in bandages. It was obvious something had happened. "I'm back, Laura." Seeing my outstretched right hand, Laura seemed to understand everything. Her face crumpled and she looked down. She probably remembered her late husband. "I'm back." I say it one more time, looking into her face and smiling. "There's no reason for you to say I'm back to me," Laura says that, batting away my right hand. Her voice trembles slightly. "I know it's selfish, but I think the reason I survived and came back was because I felt like I had to say I'm home to you." Inside the snow cave, each time I felt like I was losing consciousness, I remembered Laura's face as she arranged flowers with such concentration. Even about the first time we met on the mountain. Again and again, I kept remembering Laura. And I thought, I want her to smile. Her sad face, her angry face, her troubled face, they are all lovely, but I want to see Laura's smiling face. When I say I'm home, I want her to say welcome back as if it's the most natural thing in the world. "You say the same thing." He used to say the same thing. As Laura let out a small sigh along with her words, she slowly lifted her face to look at me. She looked at me as if she was searching for something. She probably wanted to know my true feelings. "I think the one who taught me about being human was you when all I thought about was the mountain in the past. The only one who can fill the void in me as a human is you, probably." I was a bit embarrassed and my voice trailed off towards the end, but that's how I really feel. "Will you fill the void in my heart?" At Laura's words, I nodded enthusiastically and picked her up like a child. "I'm home, Laura." When I put my forehead to hers and said that, Laura chuckled. "Welcome back, I'm glad you're safe." Laura's smile was clear like glass, and it was the kind of smile that made me feel like I had to protect her forever. A few years later, I challenged Denali once again and succeeded. From the summit, I made a call via satellite phone to report my successful climb. The one receiving that call was Laura, waiting for me at the base camp. Remembering her smile as she enthusiastically said she'd be the first one to say welcome back. "I'll be back soon." I said that at the end of the call. On the other side of the phone, Laura answered with a "yeah,"